On December 21, 1945, at his country estate in Chartwell, Winston Churchill received a telegram that would profoundly impact him. General George S. Patton, Jr., America's most feared combat commander, was dead. Churchill read the telegram, a heavy silence filling the room. He set it down, lit a cigar, and stared out the window, his mind clearly processing the weight of the news. When he finally spoke to his secretary, his words were devoid of flowery language or diplomatic pleasantries. They were blunt, brutal, and utterly revealing, exposing a truth Britain's wartime leader rarely admitted. America had produced something Britain no longer could: a general of pure, ruthless aggression. The kind of commander who won wars not with elegance, but with speed and violence. And now, that unique weapon was gone, just as the world braced for its most dangerous peace. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about what Churchill said about Patton. A perspective that will shock you. To truly grasp Churchill's reaction, you must understand what Patton symbolized to him. Churchill had just guided Britain through 6 years of a war that brought his nation to the brink. The empire was financially ruined, cities lay in rubble, and a generation of young men had been lost or maimed. By 1945, Britain was exhausted in a way that's almost incomprehensible today. Churchill knew, though he seldom voiced it publicly, that Britain could no longer win wars on its own. The era of British military dominance was over. America was now the unequivocal dominant partner in the alliance. American industrial might, American manpower, and increasingly, American military leadership would shape the post-war world. And among American generals, Patton stood alone. Churchill had meticulously followed Patton's campaigns across North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany. He had witnessed Patton unleashed, driving armies forward at impossible speeds, exploiting breakthroughs that more cautious commanders would merely consolidate, and overwhelming the enemy through relentless aggression. This was a style of warfare Churchill deeply admired because it mirrored the way Britain once fought when its empire was young, hungry, and unafraid of ruthlessness. So, when the telegram arrived at Chartwell, announcing Patton's death from injuries sustained in a car accident, Churchill immediately understood the magnitude of what had been lost. Elizabeth Leighton, Churchill's secretary, was present when he received the news. Years later, she recounted his reaction in her memoir. Churchill read the telegram silently, then stated, "Patton's dead." 2 words, delivered flatly, factually. Leighton waited, knowing more would follow. Damn shame. Damn bloody shame. The man survives 4 years of war, North Africa, Sicily, France, Germany, and dies in a car accident in peacetime. There's a cruel irony in that. He paused to light his cigar, then uttered something even more revealing. The Americans don't realize what they've lost. Not yet, but they will. This wasn't the Churchill of rousing speeches and poetic phrases. This was the private Churchill, the strategist who viewed military power in cold, practical terms. Later that evening, Churchill drafted a formal condolence message to President Truman and Patton's widow, appropriately solemn and praising Patton's courage and leadership. But it was what Churchill said off the record, to his military chiefs, his closest advisers, the few he trusted with his unfiltered thoughts, that truly exposed his beliefs about Patton. The next day, Churchill met with Field Marshal Alan Brooke, his chief of the Imperial General Staff and closest military advisor throughout the war. Their conversation, recorded in Brooke's private diary and published decades later, revealed Churchill asking, "What did you think of Patton?" Brooke, never one to mince words, replied, "Brilliant tactician, hopeless diplomat. a 19th-century cavalry officer who happened to command tanks instead of horses. Churchill nodded. Yes, precisely. And that's exactly what made him invaluable. Then Churchill made a statement that cut to the core of his view. We don't produce generals like that anymore, Alan. We can't afford to. We produce careful, competent commanders who coordinate with allies, who consider political implications, who fight wars the modern civilized way. But Patton fought wars the way wars have always been won, with speed, shock, and ruthless exploitation of enemy weakness. Brooke pointed out Patton's endless political problems, the slapping incidents, inflammatory statements, conflicts with other commanders. Of course he did, Churchill retorted. That's the price of having a weapon like Patton. He was a weapon, you understand? Not a diplomat, not a politician. A weapon. And like any weapon, he needed to be pointed in the right direction and controlled. But when you needed someone to break through enemy lines and drive 300 miles in 2 weeks, there was no one better. Then Churchill made a remarkable admission. The tragedy isn't that America has lost Patton. The tragedy is that we never had a Patton of our own. Not in this war, anyway. This confession revealed something Churchill rarely acknowledged. Britain's military leadership in World War II was fundamentally different from the aggressive, risk-taking leadership Patton embodied. British generals like Montgomery were careful, methodical, focused on minimizing casualties because Britain simply couldn't afford the losses. After the slaughter of World War I, British military culture had become cautious, almost to a fault. American generals, especially Patton, didn't operate under such constraints. America had the manpower, the industrial capacity, and the willingness to accept casualties in exchange for rapid victory. Churchill understood this dynamic perfectly. In a conversation with Anthony Eden, his foreign secretary, Churchill was even more explicit. Patton could do things Montgomery couldn't dream of doing. Not because Montgomery wasn't brilliant, he was, but because Montgomery commanded a shrinking army of an exhausted nation. Every British casualty mattered. Every decision had to be weighed against what we could afford to lose. Patton commanded an expanding army of a nation that was just getting started. He could take risks we couldn't take. He could drive forward when we had to consolidate. He could accept casualties that would have been politically impossible for us. Then Churchill added, and that's why his death matters more than people realize. America thinks it has dozens of generals like Patton. It doesn't. It has one, and now it has none. Churchill repeatedly returned to the idea of Patton as a weapon in multiple private conversations during the weeks following his death. To one aide, Churchill said, "The Americans are sentimental about their generals. They want to believe their commanders are both brilliant and lovable. But war isn't about being lovable. War is about destroying the enemy's will to fight. And Patton understood that better than anyone." Churchill elaborated, "When you needed to break the Gustav line, you called on careful preparation and overwhelming force. When you needed to coordinate a massive amphibious invasion, you called on meticulous planning. But when you needed to race across France faster than the enemy could regroup, when you needed to relieve Bastogne in 48 hours, when you needed someone who would simply refuse to accept that something was impossible, you called on Patton. He was a weapon," Churchill continued, "a difficult weapon. A weapon that needed constant maintenance and caused endless headaches, but a weapon of tremendous power. And weapons like that don't come along often." In another conversation, Churchill made the military calculus even clearer. The question isn't whether Patton was difficult to manage. The question is whether his results justified the difficulty. And the answer is obviously yes. The man drove from Normandy to the German border faster than anyone thought possible. He relieved Bastogne when everyone else said it couldn't be done. He crossed the Rhine with such speed that the Germans couldn't organize a defense. Those are the kinds of results that win wars. But Churchill's most revealing comments about Patton came when he started contemplating the future, specifically regarding the Soviet Union. By December 1945, Churchill was already deeply worried about Soviet expansionism. He had witnessed Stalin consolidate control over Eastern Europe and watched Soviet forces refuse to withdraw from occupied territories. He was increasingly convinced that the West would soon face a new kind of conflict with its former ally. This is where Churchill's assessment of Patton becomes truly profound. In a conversation with his private secretary, Churchill said, "You know what? The Soviets respected force, decisiveness, commanders who were willing to be ruthless. They respected Patton because Patton scared them. Not because of what he'd done, but because of what he was capable of doing." Churchill continued, "The Soviets understood Patton in a way they never understood Eisenhower or Bradley. Patton was a threat, a credible, immediate threat, the kind of general who might actually attack if provoked. And that's valuable even in peacetime, especially in peacetime." Then Churchill added something chilling. "We're entering a period where wars won't be fought directly. They'll be fought through threats, through demonstrations of strength, through making your adversary believe you're willing to go further than they are. And Patton was the perfect weapon for that kind of war. His mere existence was a deterrent." He paused, then added, "And now he's gone, just when we need that kind of deterrent most." In a particularly candid moment with Field Marshal Montgomery, who had his own famous clashes with Patton, Churchill articulated something that must have been difficult for the British leader to admit. "Bernard," Churchill said, "I know you and Patton didn't get along. I know he was arrogant, insubordinate, and impossible to work with at times. But here's what you need to understand. In 50 years, when historians write about this war, they're going to remember Patton more than any British general, except perhaps yourself. And they're going to remember him not despite his aggression, but because of it." Montgomery started to object, but Churchill continued, "Britain won this war through endurance, through refusing to surrender when all seemed lost, through building alliances and coordinating with partners. Those are admirable qualities, but they're not the qualities that inspire future generals or frighten future enemies. Patton's aggression, that ruthless, relentless drive forward, that's what people will remember. That's what people will fear." Churchill then made his point explicit. "We need to be honest with ourselves. Britain no longer produces generals like Patton because we no longer fight wars the way Patton fought them. We can't afford to. We're a declining power, managing our decline with dignity and skill. America is an ascending power that hasn't yet learned the limits of its strength. And Patton embodied that perfectly. All that raw, unrefined power, with no real understanding of limits. Now that power is gone," Churchill concluded, "and I'm not sure America realizes what it's lost." Perhaps Churchill's most complete assessment of Patton came in a personal letter he wrote to Field Marshal Jan Smuts of South Africa, one of his closest confidants throughout the war. The letter was not intended for publication. In it, Churchill wrote, "The news of Patton's death has affected me more than I expected. Not because I knew the man well, our actual interactions were limited, but because I recognized what he represented, a type of military leadership that history rarely produces, and that the modern world increasingly finds uncomfortable. Patton was unsuited for peacetime. He was politically tone-deaf, socially awkward outside military circles, and constitutionally incapable of the kind of diplomatic nuance that peacetime requires. But in war, he was magnificent. He understood something that most modern generals have forgotten, that wars are won not by careful accumulation of advantages, but by sudden, overwhelming applications of force at decisive moments. The Americans will miss him, though they may not realize it yet. They will look for another Patton and will not find one, because men like Patton emerge from a particular combination of temperament, training, and historical moment. That moment has passed. The age that produced cavalry officers who could transition seamlessly to commanding armored divisions is over. Churchill concluded, "We have lost a warrior in an age that will increasingly be managed by administrators, and I fear we will miss such warriors sooner than we think."